So on the show, we talk about one thing, innovation, and specifically innovation in security. Generally, that's new technology, a startup bringing a service to market, or an executive who wants to bring decades of experience to us through a conversation. But one thing we haven't talked about yet on the show is the fact that we're leaving so much talent on the table. And what Margot Hosfield brings to our attention is the fact that through proactive programs in diversity, equity, and inclusion, and fostering women in technology and specifically cybersecurity, we can close that innovation gap by increasing our talent pool, overcoming some of the barriers that we have around hiring. And the fact that there's a lot of myths that we might be laboring under that we don't have to labor under. And she walks through some of those in the conversation today. So please sit back, enjoy. It's a fascinating conversation. I learned a ton. You'll even see the light go off in my eyes a few times as I draw some analogies between frameworks to wrap my head around some of these topics of conversation. So please enjoy what is a fantastic and fascinating conversation with Margot Hosfield from Stoughton May. Pioneering solutions, transformational technology, and inspirational leaders. I'm your host, Connor Sherman, and this is the Confident Defense Podcast. Welcome to the Confident Defense Podcast. I'm your host, Connor, and today our guest is Margot Hosfield. She's a senior cybersecurity recruiter at Stoughton May. She's the founder of Growing Women in Technology and the co-founder and director of Development of Cyber DEI. Today's conversation, we're going to dive into a lot of different topics, predominantly focused around how we bring innovation into security community and into the bedrock of our culture by making it more accessible and more inclusive of everybody, regardless of what their background is. Margot, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, Connor. It's great to be here.
So Margot, as we've been prepping for this show and I've been doing my research, I'm just so excited to have this conversation because this has been something that's been on the top of my mind for the past 6 months as we've gone through. I think a lot of corporate America has come to an awakening that we haven't been building our teams and the culture of our companies the way we want to. And what we've inadvertently done is built teams that don't reflect the overall community inside the country of America. So what I was hoping for the conversation today is really to get your perspective on not only just the diversity, equity, inclusion, which is top of mind today, but then also kind of lay that bedrock, that foundation of the work that you've also been doing these past years of making just technology and specifically cybersecurity more accessible to women in the field as well, because we definitely skew male for sure. So I'd like to just kind of start with understanding what is the state of affairs today when we look at women in technology, and then also more specifically, we look at underrepresented groups in the cybersecurity community.
Yeah, definitely. Well, to put it bluntly, there's not enough diversity in the tech space, specifically in cybersecurity. So one of the biggest issues is that this conversation isn't happening. It's so important for people to recognize, and we'll dive into this a little bit deeper about the importance and what diversity means in the tech space, what it brings, what value add it has. And I think that because we haven't been having these conversations only up until, the past 6 months, of course, there have been others who've been working diligently to kind of bring this to light. I think that with, the BLM movement, that really was a mind shift for a lot of people in every industry, not even just security. We started to realize the injustices and kind of where it trickles down, throughout the world. But I have been working in the security space for about 2 years, and at which I've seen this firsthand from the client perspective and also from candidates, women and underrepresented groups in the space. And so what I've done is try to be a positive voice in the community and try and, highlight the issues that are happening and working towards and setting actionable steps to change it for the better, right?
Yeah.
And some of the ways that I've been doing this, as you mentioned earlier, one of the programs that I've instilled, I guess, or spearheaded through Stoughton May It was an existing program, started in London. The program is called Grow It, so Growing Women in Technology. And it's a community that focuses in on issues that are impacting the career development of women in tech today. Now through this group, we've leaned on each other for support. There's, we do webinars and we talk about, real issues that are impacting the community. So that's one way that I've kind of tried to do my part in a sense.
And I've seen some of the content you guys as a community are putting out. LinkedIn's the primary forum in which I've had an exposure to this. And I just found it pretty incredible. Like from someone who is outside of that universe, right? I'm a white male, so a little different than the normal demographic that communities are there to support and enable. One of the things I've really enjoyed about being on the receiving end of this information is it's an opportunity to, because there's a structure led by someone like yourself, there's a way for someone like me to come and like, oh, cool, I want to support this and enable this. And I come as an ally without having to feel like I have to overstep a boundary, if that makes sense. I don't know if you felt that I've come across guys in the community like this, but I've always felt that there's always been this almost invisible barrier where it's like, if you want to help, but you don't know quite how, what that line is, can you say these things? Can you not say those things? And so there's always just been that hesitance that comes when there isn't that structure in place. Yeah, I'm just like, I'd love to be, do you see that as a problem? Do you see that when you're in conversations?
Yeah, I mean, I think that one just depends on the person, because allies, we absolutely need them. And in my group at Grow It, we have allies who are essential, I think, to continue to grow women within the tech space. So having them even as mentors, or even just standing up and speaking up for them, colleagues, or just kind of anyone in your company, I think they're so crucial to our success and our ability to kind of lift women up in a sense. Now there are some men who are like, ooh, I don't know if I can say this, or should I do this? Can I be part of this group? Is that okay? And I think that the general answer is absolutely get involved, because we need everyone to work collectively if we're going to make any change at all.
Right. We are trying to fix the community overall, right? Not just select areas of it. So walk me through, okay, what does this space look like? What does cybersecurity look like, meant from like a mixed perspective, from like men to women, and then also from underrepresented groups to non-underrepresented groups? Is this an important topic? Yes, it's more not, but like, is it as pressing as we might think? Is the situation as dire as we might think? Kind of what are the stories that we can glean from the statistics today?
Yeah. And I'm so glad you brought that up, because I have some fun stats, not a ton from 2020, because companies are, still releasing their data from last year. But I do have a few, so I'll share those in a minute. I want to start with 2019 and some good stats that I've found. Or important ones, I feel like. So as of 2019, women make up 47% of the employed adults in the US, but only 25% of women work in tech. And of that 25%, 5% are Asian, 1% are Black, and 3% are Hispanic. Now, these statistics are coming from the National Center of Women in Information Technology. Now, all of this, despite the fact that growth of STEM jobs has boomed, as I'm sure you're in the industry, and specifically security, there's just so much demand and not enough supply. But so the STEM jobs have boomed, growing 79% since 1990, where the overall employment has grown only 34%. Now that's according to Pew Research Center.
Well, so back up for a second. Wait, let me walk you through that one. So you're telling me that like we've exploded in the growth of jobs and opportunity, and kind of barely trickled along in the growth if you're a woman.
Yes, or anyone in the underrepresented group kind of category. Yes. Staggering.
Okay, yeah. It is very lopsided. I guess that's, yeah.
Yeah, let's dive a little deeper. So let's talk about education. So, and this is again in 2019, 57% of bachelor's degrees received in 2019 were held by women, but only 21% of computer and information science bachelor degree recipients were women. So clearly there's not a ton of women who are getting degrees for various reasons. Right. And I wanted to highlight something that I found important. This number has actually dropped. So in 1985, 37% of computer science bachelor degree recipients were women. So it's interesting that, that gap, 21% now to 37% back in, 1985. I thought it would have been a little bit the opposite.
Yeah.
But I thought that was very interesting. So we're not really moving in the right direction. Now, I think it might have ticked up a little bit from, the past 5 years, but overall, there's been, and I'll touch on this in a little bit, there's been a decrease of women getting interested, or underrepresented groups interested in the industry, and then also staying in the industry, I think is key as well.
Yes.
Kind of to that point, only 38% of women who majored in computer sciences are actually working in the field, compared to 53% of the men, and that's according to the National Science Foundation.
Got it. Okay, so I'm in my head forming a picture of like, we have this workforce which is pretty equally balanced between men and women. Then we go into technology, heavily skewed into men. And again, we go one layer deeper. It's those we start to look at college degrees. Okay, so women are 20% of women are in that space. Then of that 20%, only half of them are actually still using that degree at its original intent. So actually it's even worse than that 25%, it's like 15%. So like this it seems that we have a small, more narrowing wedge of the workforce, which is women who wish to be in cybersecurity, stay in cybersecurity, are there.
Exactly. And then I wanted to also add, only 24% of women with engineering degrees are still working in engineering, compared to 30% of men. So this is a consistent trend, kind of like what you just touched on. It's called the leaky pipeline, where it's difficult to retain women in STEM jobs, which we'll definitely touch on.
Yeah, I want to unpack that in a second. Yes.
Yeah.
Got it. Okay. So the situation is such that like we've just got a really small universe. So what's driving this? Like, I know that's like almost a little silly question to ask, but because it's so simplistic and the solution and the real answer is so complex. But like, what are some of the reasons that women are either choosing not to use that degree and stay in cybersecurity, or are for one reason or another? Why is it that we have 50% of the women who get a degree in technology, are they not using it for their original intention? Like they obviously had that intention going forward, and then life has changed and they're no longer in that space. Like what leads to that?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of different things. And in my experience, just with the, women I've worked with in the industry, some of it's because, they want to start a family and they choose not to continue a career.
Mm-hmm.
Another one is just not feeling welcome at their company. The work culture, the environment is toxic. A lot of them, are subject to harassment, abuse. So I would definitely see that as a reason why, so many are wanting to leave the industry. And then I think that on top of that, they just don't feel, like I mentioned, welcome. They don't feel included. I think that inclusivity within an organization is the key to retaining women and underrepresented groups. It's not about just, putting in the numbers like, ooh, I'm going to have a diversity headcount of, 5 for my team. That's great that you have that in place, but what are you going to do to retain them, to keep them, to want them to, stay with the company, to help you all succeed, So I think it's definitely a loaded question. And there's a lot, which I definitely think we'll unpack now, but there's definitely quite a few reasons.
Okay. And so that helps me understand and the audience understand the difference between like men and women in the industry. Do those same trends tend to hold for underrepresented groups?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that, most of the stats that I was sharing just now, women kind of are within the tech space specifically,
Mm-hmm.
They are kind of considered a minority or underrepresented group within the tech space. So those are all kind of looped in. But I think that I did want to point out that it's not just, men bullying women or harassing them. It's also women too. And like, we need to step up as women and recognize there is this like kind of woman on women bullying that's happening for whatever reason. But that's an issue as well too. So it's not just gender based.
Got it. Right. There should, regardless of who's performing the negative actions, the bullying, the whatever, like that just needs to stop. Like that's not
Yeah.
what we're here for, right? We're here to, as a team, go achieve amazing things,
Exactly.
inclusive of the whole team. So I remember once, so yeah, I'll share that anecdote later, but like, so you and I have talked about or you presenting to me really these four myths of the DEI. So like when people set out to solve the imbalance in their teams, and they start to go and say, okay, great, we want to have an environment that's more inclusive, and we start hitting those targets of diversity, equity, inclusion. But what are you've mentioned there are four myths that most people struggle with when they start to overcome this and they start to tackle this problem. So what are some of the myths that people may either consciously or unconsciously be holding in the back of their head?
So the first one I want to talk about is commonly known as it's a pipeline problem, or there's not enough underrepresented groups that apply, or there's not enough underrepresented groups that graduate with STEM degrees. Now, this pipeline myth comes up usually when organizations, have talked about diversity, but they haven't actually made any meaningful changes to their hiring or recruiting processes. Because this issue can't be fixed simply by hiring underrepresented groups, which we just talked about, but actually being able to retain them. And this brings us to the importance of inclusion. Now, it's easy to set a quota for diversity hiring, but it's not as easy to assess inclusion. So one issue, the pipeline myth can cause is by, focusing on the pipeline, it can distract from the larger context of D&I. Getting underrepresented groups in the door isn't effective when you're not creating that welcoming environment.
Got it. Okay, so it's like, yes, we want to make the door more accessible for everyone to walk through, but then when they come in, we want them to stay. Okay, that makes complete sense to be an issue, but I suppose what would be some of the things that we can get into solving that addressing that particular myth, right? That like, it's not just a pipeline problem. It's like, even when you come through the door, people are willing to walk out really quickly. How do people address that?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, it requires a mind shift. It's less about, what your company gets, i.e. hiring more underrepresented groups, and more about how everyone benefits from having a more welcoming and inclusive environment. So I think that's the key to this one that people need to recognize. And it's not super easy because you have to change ultimately the culture from the ground up so that people who are coming into the environment, regardless of race, gender, ethnicity, feel really welcome and supported. I think that's the key to this myth and kind of debunking it in a sense.
Got it. Yeah. So it's not just a simple numbers game that there's just not enough people out there. There's not a pipeline. It's like you got to look at the whole thing end to end and just make sure once someone starts the process, they come through and they're going through. One of the things as I was preparing for our conversation, one of the things that came to mind was like, I had never really paid much attention to how job postings are written or where they are posted. I just assumed everybody went to the same place and read the same thing and interpreted the document the same way. I suppose that also impacts the pipeline, at least at the top of the pipeline as well.
It absolutely does. And that kind of ties into a point that I'm going to make in a little bit about opportunity versus talent and how some companies and some, hiring professionals, they get those two mixed up. So, an underrepresented person may not have access to a job posting, or the language within that job posting might not be as inviting as it is to someone else with a more similar background, with more similar experiences. So we'll definitely cover that in a bit, but it's definitely an issue that we need to debunk, I guess.
Got it. Okay, so what's myth number 2?
So the next one that I hear all the time is, I know I need more diversity on my team, but I'm supposed to hire the best person. Now, again, I've heard this multiple times from clients, and while the intention may be pure and genuinely wanting to find the most qualified person, saying this actually implies an underlying belief that the average performance of minorities across gender and race is less than the overall mean, that you must choose between having a high performing organization or opening your doors to underrepresented groups. And this belief is an example of conscious or unconscious bias. So thinking that underrepresented means not as competent.
Got it. Okay. That makes complete sense because on the surface level, it sounds very inviting. We just hire the most qualified person. We're colorblind. We're this. We're that. We're the other. We don't really care. Um, but you're right when you say that. You're inadvertently saying that, like, if I stray from the pool of candidates that I'm comfortable with, I'm inadvertently just going to drop the quality and it's just going to fall off and bubble. And I have to make this false choice between having a more inclusive pipeline versus choosing from talent.
Exactly. And this happens all the time. And I actually have an example of a recent conversation that I've had with a leader in security. And we discussed, the work I do in the D&I space, and they were super curious about understanding why diversity had to be a factor in hiring. Because again, they were really only focused on hiring the best candidates. So what I did was I broke down their hiring process. Again, their main focus being, I only want to hire the most qualified person. So what I did is I asked, where do you post your jobs? What kind of language do you use? What does your interview process look like? How often do you hire on referrals? So I mentioned how underrepresented groups may not have access to those job postings, like we just mentioned. The language they use in the job listing may not be as inviting. Underrepresented groups might not have had access to getting a degree because they come from a lower socioeconomic background. The interviewers might even pass over them, for someone who applies that they connect with, or, had similar experiences, or comes from the same background. In a nutshell, might look exactly like them. But I found that this conversation was so wonderful because after pointing out the lack of opportunity that underrepresented groups have in proportion to majority groups, they began to see how they were subject to unconscious bias during the hiring process and then decided to change things. So that's why I think that these conversations are so crucial, because some people may just not understand kind of what the issue is in their, structure or hiring process. But by kind of having that conversation, you can unfold, well, if you do this, or if you think this way, you can begin to kind of see the bigger picture.
So that's actually awesome that you had that conversation and it came to like such a when the change happened. The worst thing would be like have this conversations, this aha moment, and then nothing happens, right? You're like, well, that didn't move us forward. So I want to clarify something that, and I'd like your opinion on this because
Sure.
this field far better than I do. So we hear about bias and the bias equals bad. I think there might be a better way to define bias than saying like, if you're biased, you are bad, or if you are biased, you are wrong. And this is where I want your opinion. I'm curious of like, what would be a better way to frame the word bias? So, is it a passing judgment on the person's character who holds that bias? Is it something else? Like, how do we wrestle with this so that we can talk about bias without everyone feeling like they're, dragging themselves over broken glass?
Yeah, that's such a great question, and one that I've kind of, wrapped my head around as well, because you're right, bias has that negative connotation, and it really shouldn't, because after all, biases are shaped by the experiences that we have, going through life from, as you are as a kid, the environment that you grow up in, the mentors you have, the people you look up to, those shape your biases, and those are then dependent on, what groups are you kind of, I guess, intertwining your life with, because different groups will influence you in a different way. Now, going to your question, how do you change, or what word would be better to use other than bias? I don't know if there is one, but I think that what we need to do is change our mindset and recognize that bias, or unconscious bias, or any kind of bias that one possesses, it shouldn't be looked at in a negative way, but an acknowledgement of, these are the experiences that I have which made me think and feel this way. However, that's okay, as long as now I'm going to recognize and kind of accept that these are my biases, and then start making steps to change that, and not let it be a leading factor when you're making decisions, especially in the hiring process.
So I know it's a completely nerdy metaphor, but the way I wrapped my head around it was just like, okay, what if bias was a vulnerability, a weakness in the software in my decision-making process? I'm like, well, I don't go yell at my developers for making programming vulnerabilities. We just go and fix them together, right? There's an education component in there. There's a training, there's a tooling component there. We try and put guardrails to prevent the vulnerability from showing up in the first place. So I suppose if I look at it that way, it's like, okay, maybe bias is the vulnerability in my hiring process, in my
Mhm.
decision-making process. Then it's like, oh, okay, I know how to deal with that. Bad software all day long. I got that,
I love that. You could definitely tell you're a security person.
Exactly.
But it's a great way to describe it because it is a vulnerability, which we'll definitely touch on again. But yeah, I think I love that. I might steal that from you.
Okay, so we've hit 2 of the 4 myths. So what's the third myth we've got so far?
Okay. So the third one that I see a lot is people will say, people should be hired on their merits or our hiring process is fair. Now, this statement assumes that opportunity is evenly distributed, but as we've noted, it's not. Talent might be fairly distributed, but we need to recognize that opportunity is not. So those who use this statement, they usually are missing the fact that underrepresented groups face barriers that people in majority groups do not. For example, they don't receive as many referrals, they get passed over for promotions, they get paid less, and usually they have to work twice as hard to get the same level of recognition while facing other barriers, again, like we mentioned earlier, harassment and discrimination. Now, I've found that the merit myth is particularly difficult to talk about because we don't want to make anyone feel that they don't deserve, what they've worked super, super hard for, right? So, but at the same time, we need to acknowledge and address the barriers that underrepresented groups face. So the belief that people get where they are based on individual effort alone, i.e. hard work, rather than, by a combination of hard work, talent, circumstance, support, and luck, can be viewed as naive if you aren't, seeing the bigger picture. So
Yeah, I think every social scientist would agree with that statement.
yeah,
So you're right. I like the fact that we can again make the formula a little more, in my words, my perspective, realistic in the sense it's not just how well can you grind out on a keyboard for a decade. It really is your talent, the opportunities are presented. I think you said support, and there were 4 things in that, and I was just like, yeah, that makes so much more sense. Luck, that was the 4th one, right? Sometimes we just
yeah.
land on our feet, right?
Mhm.
Luck can present itself to you. You still have to work hard to realize the opportunity, but kind of luck brought an opportunity to you. You worked hard to realize it, and then you had the support when it got tough. Like, yeah, you're right. Maybe not everybody has that same in the same amount in the same combination.
Exactly. And it's just about kind of acknowledging that. Now, I don't know if you've actually seen this, Connor, but I've noticed that the very idea of meritocracy has become a common mindset in tech. So believing those who work hard can get ahead, which inevitably ends up giving people, comfort in that there's a sense of fairness built into the system, that
Hmm.
we get what we deserve. But as I stated before, it's not just about hard work. It's a combination of things, some of which we may not even see, which helps us move up in the world.
Unfortunately, however you want to look at it, like that, if you work hard, you get ahead in life. Like that's the American dream, right? Like that's just the core of what this
Yeah.
country's found on. So like not only is it in technology, it's in a lot of other industries too. But I think you're right. It's rather pronounced in technology. And I think part of that has to do, in my opinion, is because of how quickly things change and shift. So we see, wow, this person went from this company to this company to this company. They must be really good. Actually, they happen to live in Silicon Valley. They're pretty good developer. And they don't annoy people in the process. Okay, that's all was needed, and off they went. And so it
Mhm.
wasn't necessarily that they were the best in that, but they were given the most opportunities and had the most support along the way.
Exactly. Yeah. And then there's one other point I wanted to make about kind of this myth. I think that the issue with companies believing that the myth of meritocracy, they're definitely more likely to find themselves in trouble because as they're not going to be as vigilant about looking out for biases and making constant process improvements as the organization grows.
Hmm. Yeah, and that's got to be a tough one to overcome too, because without, is there a way that you would coach and help people overcome that? The myth that we just hire on fairness and everything's fine. Um, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I mean, there's a lot of different elements, but at the root of it, it's don't hire someone based on, education and experience. Look at the fuller picture, and then we dive into, your hiring practice and like who's interviewing, what biases do they have? Going through unconscious bias training for interviewers and anyone in the hiring process, I think is so crucial, and every company should do it. I've never even had it, but a lot of people in my company have, and I think that it completely changes the way that hiring is done within an organization, because it allows you to look past your personal biases that you've experienced growing up and look towards, okay, well, what value add will this person bring to the team? It's not just about filling this role, but it's about hiring for a team, essentially.
Got it. That makes sense. Right. I like that. Yeah, I might want to circle back on a few of these with you as they're percolating in my head. But so what about the fourth myth, right? What are some of the things that the people you work with kind of maybe trip themselves up on or struggle with?
Yeah. This one, I think is super, super important. The myth of, is it legal to consider race and gender in hiring? Now, I do want to point out that this is, a little sticky, but it's important for people and organizations to really understand. Now, some people who say this question may be using this as a way to combat, action for change. However, others may genuinely just want to know what's allowed in the hiring process. And even I had to ask this question at one point. But just to confirm, it is illegal to discriminate against an employee based on race, color, religion, sex, and age. That said, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission does state that employers can engage in efforts, quote unquote, to overcome the effects of past or present policies or other barriers to equal employment opportunity. So essentially, if a company wants to change their hiring process to be more inclusive for underrepresented groups because of the past, or because of past processes weren't as inclusive, this basically gives them the legal right to make changes and can thus hire underrepresented groups to equal the employment opportunity within the organization.
Okay. Would that take shape in the form of like when the candidate's filling out the application for the role, like often I realize there are optional fields that can say like, how would you identify, male, female, otherwise, what race would you associate yourself with, identify with? So instead of making those optionals, we might be able to make them mandatory so that we can have that bit of data. Is that appropriate, or should we keep those as optional?
That's I think that's a different issue in itself, because that's going into privacy and about like what that individual like wants to put out there. I think that I actually want people to put in that data because it helps us as companies and organizations understand what the application process looks like, which will allow us to better our job descriptions, put the postings out more freely in other areas that would be more, accessible to those groups. So I think that there's a lot in that piece, but I think that, it's, I personally would want it, but I don't know if everyone else would, I guess.
Got it. Okay. So let's keep it optional for now, but let's encourage and collect the data as we can.
Yeah. And then there was another couple points that I wanted to make about this as well. So I think that the sticky part of this part is, so companies based on this statement can set quotas for underrepresented groups. I want to hire 10, diverse persons, but they need to be cautious because it can also be used, I found, in court as evidence of illegal discrimination in a diversity program. So I'm not a lawyer, but the way I understand this is that employers, seeking to improve diversity, this law does carve out limited protection to correct the manifest imbalances. However, they need to be conscious of reverse racism. And I've, having some conversations with, white, candidates of mine, they definitely feel this reverse racism because they may be qualified, they have all the experience, but they're being passed over, which is a whole other conversation in itself. But I think it's so important for companies to really understand kind of what the legality of this means, and definitely consult lawyers.
Right.
but it's something that we need to be careful of, because we don't want, we want to correct again those imbalances, but at the same time still be respectful and conscious of not hurting and being subject to reverse racism.
Right. If the end goal is to have the security community in this particular case, or technology community larger, reflect our actual community, you're right. We don't want to exclude anybody, even including those who are already here, which would be the white candidates. But man, talk about how sticky this whole thing gets really fast, because we are trying. But as you mentioned at the top of the interview here, it's like, as long as the intent is to overcome past policies and overcome and improve them going forward, I mean, it's worth the fight. It would sound
I
like.
think so too.
So there was something I want to ask you about a larger context within this, but I didn't want to shortchange you on the myths there. Was there anything else you wanted to talk about in those 4 myths?
Nope, that's what I had.
Okay, because as powerful as they are, I think one of the things that probably adds a lot of headwind to overcoming those myths is the fact that, we do live currently in America, an incredibly divided country, right? This view is not held equally across everyone across the country. And so I want to read just kind of 2 little snippets and then get your feedback on it. But really with the heart of, like, we all work in environments and companies and teams that have a myriad of opinions and ideas. Some of them would be very pro, leaning into fixing working on DEI, others who are not and like to keep it more an established route. And this sense of dichotomy can, I think, be encapsulated in a few things here. Like this year, Trump had an executive order he passed in September, which was prohibiting certain types of diversity training. Again, Trump and Attorney General Barr denied the existence of systemic racism in the US. So that are 2 people's opinions of America, and very influential people, but they are probably echoing the sentiment of a significant chunk of America. So when we see that this is the world that we live in, like, you and I can have this conversation about, yes, we want to be a more inclusive environment. We have the other hand saying there's no such thing as systemic racism, and there's no such thing as this. And actually, diversity training, as was called in one of the articles, tantamount to divisive anti-American propaganda. So not just it doesn't exist, but like anything you talk about is actually strongly negative. So if those views are held inside the same company, right? Those views are held in people in the same team. Like, how do we cross that bridge? How do we thread that needle and have a productive conversation around this?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the key right there is how do you have that conversation? I think it takes a lot of patience and acknowledgement and respect, I think, on both parties, because you can't come into that conversation heated and being like, I'm right and you're wrong, because nothing's going to get done when you go back and forth and kind of fight over who is right and wrong. I think that where we can start to kind of bridge this gap is by coming at it from an area of understanding. And, I've actually seen within my friend groups, those who have been subject to unconscious bias and just the blissful, oh, I had no idea that I was like this. And so coming at it from like a friend's point of view and being like, okay, well, I understand that you feel this certain way and have these thoughts, but let me share some stats with you. Let me, talk about how, in certain companies, it's actually improved the productivity, the, fiscal kind of portion of a company to be super, super successful. So coming at it from more, instead of opinionated, but coming at it with facts, I found to be a little bit more stronger of an opinion, I guess you could say. But we're always going to have people who disagree with us, right? So I think it's about the approach that we take and coming at it from that element of, I understand where you're coming from and I'm going to hear everything you have to say, but I also want you in turn to listen to what I have to say, kind of establishing that respect between the 2 parties.
Yeah, a lot of good productive conversations can happen when there is open conversation, which is based on respect. But yeah, it doesn't make it an easy conversation.
No, it doesn't. But I think that the more that we start to have these conversations and recognize, these issues, the easier it will get. We've
Mm.
already made some strides. I think that this past year, working with, my, Grow It group, I've seen a huge push for women in tech and women in security, which is so exciting because these conversations are being had, in the right spaces. So even though we may still have a few characters who aren't on the same page, I think that more and more of us are starting to recognize that there is an issue and want to do something about it.
So I want to circle back on a concept that you brought up at the top of the conversation, which is like DEI. Can we start to frame having a more inclusive program and hitting these DEI targets the right way as a means to increasing the talent pool versus having the false conversation, excuse me, the false choice between having to choose between diversity and talent? Like, where do you see DEI being used as a tool to actually proactively increase innovation and increase the talent pool that inside the security community?
Yeah. I think that in order to stay competitive, it's so important for businesses always to strive for innovation. And I've done, not research myself, but looked into a lot of, surveys and research that's been done before in the past. And a lot of them, suggest, some of the ways to boost innovation is actually by hiring more women in underrepresented groups. So there was a study published in Innovation Management Policy and Practice, and these authors analyzed levels of gender diversity in research and development teams for, I think it was like over like 4,000 companies in Spain. And using statistical models, they actually found that companies with more women were more likely to introduce new innovations into the market over a 2-year period. And in another study published in the Economic Geography, I think it was, the authors concluded that increased cultural diversity is a benefit to innovativeness. So they pooled data on about 7,500 firms that participated in, I think it was London's annual business survey. So, which is a questionnaire conducted, with the UK's capital execs, and they're asking a number of questions about, their company's performance. And the results revealed that the businesses run by culturally diverse leadership teams were more likely to develop new products and those with than those with homogeneous leadership.
Kind of makes sense. Okay, but that's great to hear the statistics behind what would make sense to a lot of folks, which is that if you bring in different viewpoints who have different backgrounds, who have different experiences, they will see different opportunities in different markets, and with them bring with them the technology, or bring them the talent to then go solve and capitalize on those opportunities. So
exactly. Yeah, and it means that enriching your team, with representatives of different genders, race, nationalities, it's key for boosting, companies' joint intellectual potential. Creating, a more diverse workplace will help you keep your team members' biases also in check and make them question their assumptions. And as I mentioned earlier, we also need to make sure the organization has inclusive practices so that everyone feels they can be heard. So all of this, I think, together can make, your teams smarter and ultimately make your organization more successful.
that makes cool. So let's dive into this for a second. So one of the things I do want to get into is the action of like, how as security leaders do we fix this problem, or what are some of the tools and techniques that we could start to implement as leaders inside the security space, and then of course as investors who are looking at what companies are going to do the best over the long term. What, as you mentioned, one of the ways an investor might be looking at their portfolio was like, actually, how inclusive is the companies that I'm hiring and how diverse is their leadership team, so on and so forth. So granted that the idea that having a more inclusive working environment, having a more inclusive company leads to things being better, as you mentioned, what are some of the tools and techniques that we could start to employ?
Yeah. And I'm so glad that you mentioned this, because there is a solution, and it's just about taking the right steps, right? So, it's not going to be easy, as we've kind of already addressed, but again, conversations like these are so crucial to correcting the equality imbalance. So some of the things that I found to be helpful and have suggested to some companies, giving credit where it's due. So in order to, build a stronger culture, managers, coworkers, and execs really should call out instances of hard work that's going unnoticed. Then create a plan where all hard work is praised equally. So this comes with the inclusivity piece, right? You want to make sure that everyone is getting acknowledged for the work they're doing and feeling included, right? Two, require diverse candidate pools for hiring, promotions, and board seats. Third, I would hire based on potential, not just current competencies and backgrounds. Again, going back to that, it's about opportunity and the lack thereof opportunity for underrepresented groups, right? Number four, putting hiring managers and evaluators through unconscious bias training, which I think is the most important one. I should know.
Fair. No, I think and I'm glad you landed on that one because it goes back to the idea that we have vulnerabilities in our decision-making software. And we all know that like how you fix a vulnerability management program is that it starts with education on the people who are writing code, in this case, making the decisions. It's putting in safety guardrails to ensure that no one goes into the red zone. They're all hanging out in the green zone for as much as they can. That sounds like the talent pools that you were talking about, making sure the metrics and the numbers are where they need to be as you're coming through that whole chain reaction. And then it's the continuous monitoring and kind of error correcting we'd have in software, where again, if I were to draw the analogy, that would be what you were just discussing about having praise and making sure the inclusive nature is there, making sure the cultural pieces are there. So if anything else, I've learned that like, finally, there's an allegory that works for me where I'm like, cool, I don't have to worry about like bias is bad. I have a more robust way of thinking about it. So thank you.
Absolutely.
So, I mean, there's a lot to unpack here. And you mentioned again that it's difficult, it's hard work because we are changing. Right now, it kind of feels like we're swimming upstream, where I feel the real solution here is actually to change the direction of the current versus ask everyone to swim upstream, which is even harder than swimming upstream. So with that, I know you've got a few things that you're deeply involved in, which is the nonprofit Cyber DEI, the women, the growing women in technology, the Grow It. Where can people dive in to learn a little bit more and connect with you on in those areas?
Yeah, absolutely. So I do want to mention, so Cyber DEI is a nonprofit that I started with some incredible female and male leaders in the security space. And our mission and the reason why we decided to, start this nonprofit is because there has been a lot of, again, like I mentioned earlier, progress for women in tech still needs a ton of work, and we have, a lot to go. But there's been a big boom for that, but not as much for all the underrepresented groups. So we wanted to create a safe space where everyone, so women, men, LGBTQ, anyone under the underrepresented group bubble, has a space to lean on, peers for support, learn new, security tools, just have solid conversations relevant to what's going on in the industry also, and just kind of lean on each other for support. So our mission is to foster a safe and inclusive community for all individuals interested in cybersecurity and to create systemic changes in the way diversity and inclusion are approached in the industry. So I think that, going back earlier to some of the solutions, my number 5 would be finding your network or finding a support system where you feel comfortable to talk about issues that are happening in your life or some that you're seeing in your organization. Because again, by having those conversations, you really can start to change, the language essentially. And then through my Grow It community, it's been a phenomenal, I guess, program that I've created, and it's a really great because the community we focus in on issues that are impacting the career development of women in tech today. So I do webinars, used to do in person. Hopefully, we'll go back to that one day. And I get female leaders in the tech space who talk about the issues that they've gone through, through their journey through tech, and then in that space, as we have younger women who are interested in joining the community, they can start to see, oh well, this incredible woman who's in this leadership role, she did it, even though she's going through the same struggles that I went through. this is how I can make it, and finding that support group, I think is huge. So, anyone who's interested in joining either, my Grow It community, or Cyber DEI, you can have them contact me directly, and I can, get them in touch with the right people.
Fantastic. And so, Margot, I just want to again thank you so much for your time today. I will say to everyone in the audience who's been listening to this, there is a lot of statistics we threw at your way. There's a lot of reference material. So we'll put all of that in the show notes, including a link to Margot on LinkedIn, where you can connect and continue the conversation with her there. So again, Margot, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate you coming on the show and helping us unpack, which is a difficult, thorny, but well worth it problem to tackle. So thank you so much for your time today.
Of course, and thank you so much, Connor. It was great being here with you.
Till next time.